Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of History of the Wild West. Today, we are going to be talking about the Oklahoma Panhandle and the origins and histories of no man's land. A place that you may associate with your stereotypical Clint Eastwood-esque cowboys, full of bandits and outlaws. But how much of this imagery comes from the lawless region of the southern United States? From the region's conception to the events that took place to settle the area, up until the Great Dust Bowl, which left the area in ruins, leaving it with minimal population even to this day, we will be taking a look at this fascinating history with many twists and turns. Was no man's land really just the lawless and violent place that some make it out to be? This region has gone by many names throughout the years, such as Cimarron Territory, the Neutral Strip, the Public Land Strip, the Oklahoma Panhandle, but most importantly for this video, no man's land. This region of North America was originally populated by multiple groups of indigenous peoples, such as the Antelope Creek peoples, the Comanches, the Apaches, and the Kiowas. These groups were the main inhabitants of this land until the Spanish came along, bringing disease, famine, and destruction that would force out many of the residents who had called this land their home. This land was under Spanish control until 1821, when Mexico had established their own independent nation. Roughly 15 years after Mexico gained their independence, which included this area, the Republic of Texas gained its own independence from Mexico, becoming its own republic, which included the area that is now known as the Oklahoma Panhandle. The Republic of Texas was considered a slave state. Slavery was prohibited above the 36 by 30 latitude, which was established by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Instead of the Republic of Texas prohibiting slavery in this area, they decided that they would rather give it up in 1845 so they could continue their acts of slavery within the Republic without any kind of conflict caused by this act. This established the lower border of the Panhandle. The northern border was established along the 37 mark in 1854 by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which went against the Missouri Compromise, allowing both states to decide on whether or not slavery would be prohibited. After these events, the term public land strip was given to the area, but it was better known as no man's land. The idea of no man's land began in 1850, but was fully put into place in 1854 after its northern border was established. This land was not owned by Texas, Kansas, or Nebraska, leaving it to be an ungoverned region of North America surrounded by developing states, but no one wanted to control this area, leading to its title of no man's land. No man's land was a region without its own government, which meant that nobody was able to govern or enforce laws. This meant that it was a region where many criminals came to use it as a safe haven to get away from the law and any sort of repercussions that they may fall victim to. The commonly perceived notion behind no man's land is that it was completely lawless and full of criminals. While it may have had some truth to it, this does not describe the full picture. No man's land was full of all different kinds of people. Some were just looking for property that was unclaimed and trying to start a farm. Some were the indigenous peoples of the land, such as the Comanches, Apaches, and Kiowas, and some, of course, were the aforementioned criminals looking for a place to be safe. The writings of Elmer E. Brown describe the land in a different way than most would have believed. His accounts tell the story of what no man's land would have been like from the perspective of a family man who was just trying to settle some property. Brown describes the land as a place that would still look down on criminals. They would be able to come to this region to escape their crimes from elsewhere, but that did not mean that they would have free rein to do as they pleased. Since this was a lawless land, it meant that its inhabitants also had free rein to protect themselves as needed, which meant that more violent and forceful means of defense were permitted. At the time, there were no official law enforcement in this region, but there were still outlaws who would uphold some moral laws by immoral means. There was nobody to tell these vigilantes that they must abide by the statutes that would be upheld for a normal officer of the law. They were able to carry out their self-given job as freely as they saw fit, which could act as a deterrent to others who would attempt to commit crimes in this region. There were many people who settled this land before it became known as the Public Land Strip, or No Man's Land. The people living in this region were forced to learn how to defend their property. This fits in line with the region's Texan roots, with an early prototype to the castle doctrine, allowing residents to kill someone who comes on their property. There were still people who were trying to commit crimes and get away with it in this land, which meant that in order to keep their family and home safe, they needed to be willing to protect themselves by any means necessary. And due to the lawless nature of this region, they could do anything that they wanted to do this. Homeowners were forced to learn how to defend themselves, which created a unique culture of armed people willing to kill if they needed to, even if they might be peaceful people by nature. Since it was a region without its own government, or even a government to control the area, building a new family home was not easy. The way that people would declare land as their own would be to build a home or a barn to signify that it was already occupied. This was a very common occurrence that was even used during the land rush of 1889, although during the land rush there were other means of claiming land as well. The people of No Man's Land came from all over to settle down here. They came from many different backgrounds and beliefs. Due to the diversity of the people here, almost everybody respected each other. Nobody would really know if the person beside them was a vicious outlaw or a peaceful farmer who was just looking for a new area to settle down. Many of the farmers who went there only grew enough food to keep themselves full. There was little to no wealth that was able to be procured from this region. There was very little infrastructure, very few shops, and almost no export from this region at the time. The economy left the people there in a state where all they could do was try to survive on their own, ignoring the financial tasks that they may need if they were living somewhere else. Elmer E. Brown describes the people of No Man's Land differently than what many would have believed. He stated that the people there were like any other rural community in this part of the United States. They were not super violent. It was a very underdeveloped area, which means there was little there to protect and little to steal. The amount of crime committed against the people living here was less than to be expected from a region with no laws. The people there would defend themselves and their property when they needed, but it was not super common that they needed to do this in rural areas. There was not much business that actually occurred in the Panhandle at this time, but there were banks and bars set up in Beavertown, which was one of the most populous towns in the region. In other parts of the Panhandle, other means of making money were also going on, such as buffalo skin trading and hunting. There were an estimated 5.5 million buffalo killed in Oklahoma, which left the remaining 25 or so buffalo from the Great Southern Herd of Buffalo to seek refuge in the Oklahoma Panhandle. There was a large market for buffalo in this region, which led to the near extinction of the species here. After most of the buffalo were killed, many indigenous groups that still occupied the region, such as the Comanches, Kiowas, and Apaches, were forced to relocate, as there was little reason to stay in the region with everything that had occurred, from the Spanish killing many of them, to the Americans killing all the buffalo and taking their land. In 1889, thousands of men gathered around the border that defined the great expanse of No Man's Land. There would be a giant competition filled with grand adventure. A countdown would begin, and then would begin the race. The Land Rush of 1889, sometimes called the Land Run of 1889, was an event where thousands of people would line up at the border of No Man's Land, and when it was signaled, everybody would rush in to claim their own slice of the great expanse. The opportunity to claim land in No Man's Land and finally settle this land would begin. There were approximately 70,215 homestead land patents issued, according to Douglas Allen in his book Rationing by Racing and the Oklahoma Land Rushes. The number of people involved is unknown for sure, but it is clear that there were tens of thousands of people involved in this event. Elmer E. Brown described the sight of this great contest by saying, "We, the spectators, witnessed the spectacle with most intense interest. Away dashed the thoroughbreds, the broncos, the pintos, and the mustangs at a breakneck pace across the uneven surface of the prairie. It was amazing to witness the recklessness of those cowboy riders. They jumped obstacles, they leaped ditches, they cantered with no diminution of speed through water pools, and when they came to a ravine too wide to leap, they would go down with a rush and up the other side with a spurt of energy to scurry once more like mad over the level plain." This retelling of what occurred describes a spectacle that would be truly a once in a lifetime opportunity. It is something that will likely never happen anywhere else in the world, creating a really unique opportunity for the witnesses. This event was what sparked the Panhandle's official joining of the United States, and more specifically, Oklahoma. The land rush attracted thousands of people to the Panhandle. It was a new opportunity for people to set up their own land and start a family in the new area of the United States, which meant that people flocked to the opportunity. This land rush was a truly unique and historical event that was the only reason that the Panhandle had any significant population. Without this event, there were very few people living in this region, but its population grew very significantly during this time period. In 1907, 18 years after the land rush, the Panhandle gained statehood and joined Oklahoma. It was divided into three counties: Cimarron, Texas, and Beaver, which are in order from west to east. It was the beginning of the 1900s that formal development began in the Panhandle. After the land rush occurred, the population of the area was significantly higher for about 40 years. This was until a great disaster occurred, which speared its head as the Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Normally, when one thinks about natural disasters in North America, they may think of an earthquake, hurricane, or a tornado. Very few would think about a dust storm, and if they did, they might not be aware of how brutal and destructive it could be. The Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s will give you another disaster to be aware of and demonstrate just how awful this really could be. Leading up to the Great Dust Bowl, the Panhandle had experienced many hardships that made living here quite difficult. There were great blizzards in 1911 to 1912 and 1918 to 1919, which killed off much of the cattle that was being raised here. There was intense flooding in 1914 that destroyed much of the land and killed many people. There was a great storm that flooded much of the region near Guymon in Texas County in 1925. Much of the region was very dry for the most part. It made land difficult to farm, which meant that most farmers would set up near the Beaver River, which spanned all the way across the Panhandle. This way, they would be able to obtain the water that they needed for their crops. It was a strange place that experienced a lot of dryness throughout the years, and then would be met with giant floods that would destroy crops and homes. The weather here was dangerous, and in the early 1900s, the weather was by far the biggest threat to people's livelihood. The Panhandle had experienced dust storms in the past, with accounts starting in 1893, but it was not until the 1930s that it got really bad here. The name that was given to this decade was the Dirty Thirties, for the great dust storms that would occur. Starting on April 12th, 1934, the drought that was plaguing the land, along with high speed winds and extreme temperatures, created a unique occurrence. 300 million tons of soil and dirt were lifted into the air, coming from the Great Plains and moving eastward. This would be known as the Great Dust Bowl. The following year was even worse, with the storm being named the Black Blizzard, which brought along 2 hours of complete darkness at high noon when the sun was supposed to be shining. In 1937, the Panhandle experienced 110 different dust storms, and finally in 1939, on March 11th, a great dust storm occurred that left 4,778,320 square miles of the Panhandle under 1 foot of dust. The land was almost completely inhospitable at this time, leaving its residents to either flee or suffer under the dust. The number of farms left in this region by the 1940s was less than 78% of what they previously were. Even after all of this occurred, there were more dust storms to come. None as brutal as the ones that had happened in the Dirty 30s, but it still made living here extremely difficult. After this time period, it is not hard to see why so few people live there to this day. The Oklahoma Panhandle, once known as No Man's Land, grew to be a somewhat prosperous region, but after the Great Dust Bowl, no one was willing to live there anymore. The region was mostly given up on. In 1907, there were an estimated 35,729 people living in this region. Today, there are only 28,729 people living there, according to the 2020 US Census, even though the population of Oklahoma keeps growing. The Oklahoma Panhandle went by many names, such as No Man's Land or the Public Strip. It was a region that for many years was unclaimed by any sort of government and did not belong to anybody. It had many exciting and terrifying years, such as the land rush of 1889, which brought in thousands of people to the area and allowed it to flourish. But the terror truly began in the 1930s when the Great Dust Bowl occurred and wiped out its population, leaving it to never fully recover. Even to this day, there are not many people living here. The Great Dust Bowl had an immeasurably devastating effect on the people of this region. Thank you for watching. It was truly a pleasure to teach you about this often forgotten piece of North American history. Make sure you like and subscribe so I can see you in the next video.